Welcome, everyone, to this special session on valuing water. It is actually a very special session because you will have two facilitators. One, me here in person, and Catherine Cross, who I will introduce later on, who will be our online facilitator. Oh, and Catherine's here. But before I hand over to Catherine, can I just remind the delegates, especially the online ones, that we use Slido, as we have been using in the last 2 to 3 days for your Q&A. So if you haven't downloaded Slido, please download Slido or go into the slido.com, type IRS 2022. And for this room, please pick 1.2, room 1.2 we're in. And then that allows you to send questions to the presenters as we go along. And then both Catherine and I will take turns with answering these questions, throwing these questions back to the presenters. So once again, thank you very much for joining us today in this room. I have the pleasure in introducing my co-facilitator, Catherine Cross. Kath, over to you.
Thank you very much, Eva. So just very briefly, this session is a launch of a much-awaited publication on valuing water. But I would like to first invite the Australian Water Partnership General Manager, Sarah Ransom, to provide some opening remarks and give some context. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Catherine. Thanks, Eva, and hello to everybody in Europe, and good evening to everybody here in Australia. I'm Sarah Ransom. I'm the General Manager of the Australian Water Partnership, and I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from Ngunnawal country in Canberra, Australia. I pay my respects to the traditional owners and First Nations peoples as the custodians of the land where I'm joining this meeting from today. I pay my respects to the elders, past, present and emerging, and thank them for their ongoing care of country and waters. The Australian Water Partnership is really pleased to be an official workshop partner of the International River Symposium, and we'd really like to welcome you to this launch today, this publication, Valuing Water, the Australian Perspective, Lessons from the Murray-Darling Basin. The 3 case studies and synopsis are a collaborative effort between the World Bank, Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and the Australian Water Partnership to promote more equitable, transparent and effective management of water resources development. Together, they tell the story of valuing water in the basin through the primary lenses of economics, the environment, and Australia's First Nations cultural values of water. Examining how the diverse values placed on water provides insights into the development and management of water resources in the Murray-Darling Basin. The Murray-Darling covers an area of 1 million square kilometres in the southeast of Australia, and so it's our country's most important water catchment. It provides water to 2.3 million people, countless native habitats and thousands of farms. It is also an area of significant cultural importance to the First Nations peoples of Australia. Australia's major water reforms have centred on the Murray-Darling Basin and the challenges arising from the extensive development of its water resources over more than 100 years in a highly variable climate, subject to persistent, long dry periods and drought, as well as large floods. Australia's largest river system provides valuable lessons that can inform good international practices. So these publications come at a really opportune time following the recent COP27 in Egypt and the lead up to the UN 2023 Water Conference. There is an increasing focus on water issues, both in relation to climate change, but also more broadly in relation to water security. Accurately valuing water helps to reveal the costs and benefits of different actions, or in some cases, the lack of action, and how these costs and benefits are distributed across those who use water within a basin, the different uses of water, as well as how this changes in both time and across space within the basin. Understanding the value of water resources through different lenses leads to more informed decision-making from the household level right through to governments that make decisions that affect industries, communities and the environment. It also helps better understand the different options to manage water, including how it is allocated between different needs and uses for all. So on behalf of AWP, I would like to thank and congratulate all the authors and reviewers for this major effort. We're really looking forward to this launch tonight and the future opportunities that might arise to share the lessons on valuing water from the Australian story with our international colleagues. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Thanks for those remarks. So as Sarah mentioned, this publication was developed in partnership with one of our key AWP partners, the World Bank. So I'd like to invite David Caxton, who's a senior economist at the World Bank, to also say some opening remarks. Thanks.
Thank you, Catherine, and good morning to those of you in Vienna, and greetings to everyone connected online. I join you from Jakarta today, and it's a great pleasure to be able to join you this morning for the launch of these case studies exploring the Australian perspectives on valuing water from the Murray-Darling River Basin. I'm sure that all of us gathered together today can appreciate the fact that water is central to human development, to economic growth, and the health of our planet. There is a strong consensus that water is at a crossroads and urgent action is needed, particularly in the face of climate change. However, the global water crisis continues to accelerate, and our capacity to adapt to this crisis and deal with the challenges presented by climate change is not currently keeping pace. As a result, we are not on track to meet Sustainable Development Goal 6, which is to ensure water and sanitation for all. And in some regions, and among some of the client countries that the World Bank works with, we are seeing backsliding on those goals. And this is despite the fact that technical solutions exist to many common water sector problems. They are known and they are available. Underlying this is the fact that many challenges in the water sector reflect the fact that water continues to be undervalued, underpriced, and because of that, underfunded. Part of the challenge is that water has a private good element to it and a public good element to it. It's private when it's in the pipes in a factory, and it's public when it's supporting environmental and cultural values in the river outside. Depending on the location and the time, many of these different uses and different values of water find themselves in competition with each other. So overcoming this challenge of valuation and reflecting values in policy requires bold action. It requires clear messages to policymakers and to those who are investing in the water sector. And this is where the evolution of Australia's experience in balancing those competing demands in the Murray-Darling River Basin can be so important and useful. The reports that we'll hear about today are built on a long history of partnership and outreach by our organisations. For the bank, an important moment was the co-convening of the high-level panel on water with the United Nations and various heads of state. Also important is the Global Water Security and Sanitation Partnership. Through these and others, the bank has been able to draw on the experiences from around the world in support of our client countries. That support includes a diverse portfolio of more than 182 projects under preparation and implementation, totaling more than $31 billion for the water sector alone. The reports today are not intended to provide all of the answers for balancing between those economic, environmental and cultural values, but they do reflect on the important journey made by Australia, and thus they provide some generalisable lessons that will hopefully be useful for policymakers, civil society organisations and academics in other countries as they grapple with some of the most important water challenges of our era. So to close, I want to first thank and congratulate the authors. It's been a pleasure working with you. And I want to thank the Australian Government Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Australian Water Partnership and other contributors to this endeavour, as well as our audience for your time today. Looking forward to the discussion and continuing this collaboration. Back to you, Catherine.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you both to Sarah and David for those opening remarks and providing the context for these really great publications. So just to give you an idea of the run of the session, we're going to have three presentations and one recording. These reflect the three different case studies and also the synopsis. We'll then have some respondents who are on site in Vienna, Dr. Andrea Hafner and Renee Woods, just reflect on the case studies and synopsis. And then we do have some time for questions at the end of the session. So if you do have some questions for the presenters, please put them in Slido, and we'll relay them towards the end of the session. So now I'd like to pass back to Eva to introduce our first speaker.
Thanks, Sarah. And like we said before, we are very privileged and honored to actually have the launch of this exciting publication as part of the International River Symposium, especially for today, because the theme today is about financing river resilience. So it's very apt that we're doing this today. With that, can I please introduce Sarah Leck? Sarah is the principal at AIDA. And Sarah, we will put you on now for your presentation.
Great, thanks, Eva. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the Whadjuk people, who are the traditional owners of the land that I'm speaking to you from today. So I'll be talking to you about the economic values of water, but I just wanted to clarify that this doesn't mean that environmental and cultural values are separate from or not included in economic values. And so it's crucial that in valuing water, we do continue to consider these three elements together and fully value all aspects of water use to avoid perverse outcomes. Catherine, can you move on to the next slide, please? Thanks. So I just wanted to start by considering what it means to value water. I think this is a bit of an ongoing challenge where it's often assumed that value means financial and monetary value, but our approach to valuing water needs to be much broader than that. And economics is useful here. Economic value is really focused on overall benefits, whether monetary or otherwise. So that includes anything that increases individual well-being. That can include financial well-being from higher income or lower costs, but also physical well-being from improved health, mental well-being from, for example, having access to the environment, as well as many other benefits. The challenge really comes when we're trying to make water management decisions that reflect these multiple and sometimes conflicting values. All water management decisions that are already being made are already implicitly valuing water for different uses and trading off these uses against one another. However, the implicit valuation given to different uses of water may not really reflect the actual value, particularly when relating to environmental or cultural use. So making these implicit values explicit really helps decision makers to better value water. So if we're able to value water, it really requires us to, valuing water really requires us to understand the value of water in all its uses and for different users today and into the future. And doing that enables us to build resilient water infrastructure that fully reflects and protects different values of water and increases the overall value realized from finite water resources. And we also can then better manage water resources to maximize their net value, including by making informed, transparent, and consultative trade-off decisions. Given the scale of the world's water challenges and the investments needed in response to those challenges, making even marginally better decisions can generate enormous benefits and avoid costly and irreversible mistakes. We go to the next slide. Thanks, Catherine. So how have we valued water in Australia's Murray-Darling Basin over time? Well, I won't go through the whole history of water policy in the Murray-Darling Basin over the last 100 years now, although we do manage to cover a fair amount in the report. Also, just as a disclaimer, this part of the report is focused on the history since the 1900s, and that obviously excludes tens of thousands of years of management and use by Aboriginal Australians, which Phil, I think, will discuss a bit later. But the key message here really is that the way the water has been valued at a policy and management level has changed significantly over this time period. So in the early years, the management of water really reflected a focus on the value of water for productive use, particularly for agriculture, with no understanding of environmental or cultural values associated with water use, and also very limited understanding of the importance of urban or town use and values as well. But this has changed, in particular in response to some declining water availability and quality issues that we've had in Australia, including during the millennium drought. And these water availability and quality issues really forcibly demonstrated the importance of water in the environment, and also were able to highlight the growing trade-off between use for agriculture and use for other human needs. It's really only more recently that policies started to address and reflect cultural values as well as environmental values in water management and policies and decisions. And we can kind of see this story in the volume of water diversions shown on the chart there, obviously not accurately, but just illustratively. So water diversions grew continually from the 1900s through to the 1990s. But since the introduction of caps and water reforms, they have been declining while the value of water use has continued to be maintained. We'll go to the next slide. So what economic tools can be used to help value water? So there are many different economic tools that we can use, including things like cost-reflective pricing principles, pollution pricing, total economic value approaches, which we discuss in the report. But just given the short time here today, we've focused on water markets here, which is an important tool used in the context of the Murray-Darling Basin in particular. So water markets enable scarce water resources to be flexibly reallocated across sectors and users according to marginal value, and they allow individuals to make real decisions based on their assessments of the marginal value of water. As with all markets, the design, regulation, and operation of water markets does influence their effectiveness. But while there have been some challenges in Australia, overall the water market has enabled major redistribution of water between users, in particular during years of scarcity such as 2008 and 9. That was a major drought year, but trade allowed some agricultural producers, such as rice growers, to sell water to others, such as horticultural growers who had a higher value for the water. So you can kind of see that in the chart here, where there's a major reduction in water use, but the value, which is the red line, but the blue line, which is the gross value of irrigated agricultural production, doesn't decline by nearly as much. So the market was able to reallocate the water to the most productive use. And then the final slide. So what can we really learn from the Australian experience? Well, we see that when water is valued only for consumptive use, policy and management is going to focus on maximising extraction and use, and often that's to the detriment of other users and uses. But properly valuing water requires giving consideration to economic, social, cultural and environmental benefits, and provides a more informed basis for policy and management decisions. There's multiple practical ways in which we can reveal the value of water, and our ability to include that value in decision-making is improving, especially in Australia. While we have further room for improvement, in particular relating to cultural values, the Australian experience really makes it clear that valuing water can significantly improve decisions relating to the management of scarce water resources. Thanks, everyone. That's it from me.
Thank you, Sarah. I'll just move on to our next presenter. And so this is Rod Marsh. He's going to be talking about the environmental values of water in the Murray-Darling Basin. So, Rod, I think you're going to share your screen. So Rod Marsh is the principal with Marsh Eco.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Good morning. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Like the others, there's a lot in this case study, and I've only got a little time, so I'm going to focus on one of the key lessons that's generally relevant. Valuing water for the environment and expressing those values in concrete policy action is primarily about people and politics. The case study on the Murray-Darling Basin shows how managing water and catchments is more a political, social and institutional challenge than it is a scientific and technical one. Allocating water to the environment requires that choices be made about who gets what, when and how, which is a famous definition of politics. Power matters, and this is not just the power to decide, but the power to set the agenda and the power to influence how issues are framed. Decisions about valuing environmental water never occur on their own terms. They're always embedded in the context of past, present and emerging political choices. They will be contested, they will be picked up opportunistically by political actors, and they will be intertwined with other political issues. This is particularly true in transboundary river basins, whether within nations or across them. This is not to say that science, engineering, economics and technical knowledge don't matter. They do. But they don't make or implement policy on the ground. They don't provide easy solutions for what are difficult policy choices in a world of global change. A quick tour of the history of water resources development in the Murray-Darling Basin can give us some examples. The catchments and rivers of the Murray-Darling have been extensively modified since the mid-19th century. Since the dispossession and displacement of the original Aboriginal land and water managers of the basin, settler modifications to the basin's landscapes and waters have substantially altered the hydrology and the ecology of river systems and catchments. To take just one example, the pulse of ecological change from mid-major 20th century dam building and river regulation is likely to have been faster and larger than the protected impacts of climate change in the 21st century. But not just rivers have been regulated. The whole catchment's been changed. Policy choices designed to drive patterns of human settlement and economic development created powerful political constituencies. Despite a widespread recognition of overallocation of water resources, the consequent reduction in water use to some sustainable level required and requires the majority of the necessary reductions to fall on agricultural users whose water use had been strongly encouraged and financed by governments for most of the 20th century. This is a major structural adjustment. But how much water? Where? By when? How? And from whom? This remains and is likely to remain a major political contest of values. The difficult politics has been played out over more than 2 decades and resulted in a broad mix of approaches to water recovery for the environment. A major drought, an Australian government budget surplus, and a national election where environment and climate change had a prominent place helped catalyse major changes in the 2000s. But we can't forget that as much of what's been possible is due to the politics of this period as to decisions made over 100 years ago about how water is managed in Australia and the division of power between the states and the Australian government and the institutions built ever since, from land and water tenure systems, intergovernmental forums to river operations, markets and environmental water managers. The result is that around 1/5 of the water previously diverted, on average, for consumptive use has now been returned to the environment. But as you can see, progress has been punctuated by politics. Legislative change altered the pace of environmental water recovery when water buybacks were capped. The lesson from the case study is that water and catchment politics is never finished. Those interests who lose in one political cycle do not disappear. They return to challenge policy implementation or future policy development. The business as usual interaction among competing interests and advocates with different desired policy outcomes can lead to policy deadlocks and radical policy change. A recent example of a policy deadlock is the fate of the Water for Environment Special Account. It was established with a budget of nearly 1.8 billion Australian dollars in 2013 to recover 450 gigalitres of water for the environment and to ease or remove constraints that prevent the delivery of environmental water to where it is needed. After 7 years, little water has been recovered, fewer constraints removed, and little money spent, as you can see in the gap between the green line of expectations and the blue line of actuals. There are no easy answers to environmental water recovery. It's a space where one author puts it, facts are uncertain, values in conflict, stakes high and decisions urgent. It's political, complex and deeply contested. The lesson from the case study is we need to understand environmental water recovery and the identification of environmental values in broader historical and political and social dynamics. And these will ensure that options for change are context and path dependent in ways that limit and shape available options. Australia's successes have come where policymakers have worked with citizens and communities and understood they're working in a highly modified basin characterised by a mosaic of uses and users. They have struggled when solutions have been applied top-down and pushed hard towards contested targets. Successful return of water to the environment relies on coordination of actions and diverse values. Without this, there's water allocated to the environment in a dam, but not in a river, a wetland or a floodplain. Success has come from the coordination of answering the value-laden questions of how much, when, where and how with water managers, river operators, landowners, water users, traditional owners and communities. Success has come from learning when to accept, what to adapt and what to design in a modified system, and always seeking a better politics and better approaches to decision making. Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you, Rod. That was actually very inspirational from a point of view of the government in terms of the championing of the government for environment, for the value of water from an environmental perspective. And in fact, later on in the closing, we will have the Commonwealth government water holder, environmental water holder will actually give us the closing in relation to what Rod just presented today. As Catherine has indicated, it's not only the economic, it's not only the environmental, but we also have the cultural value of water. And with that, can I please introduce Phil Duncan? Phil Duncan is the Senior Aboriginal Consultant of Alluvium. Over to you, Phil.
Yeah, Mariva, I too want to open up with an acknowledgement of country. I join you from the foreshores of Kamay, known as Botany Bay, pay my respects to the Bidjigal people, but also the many nations across the Murray-Darling Basin, the 47 nations, and those that join us globally. Much respect to your elders, past and present, and those that are emerging, not just across the Murray-Darling Basin, the country Australia, but globally. The opportunity to collaborate through a strategic partnership and a relate that's developed into a sound relationship on trust and respect with AWP, and the opportunity of that relationship that gives us connection to the World Bank is very, very much appreciated, and be able to be involved in the development of a cultural case study highlighting water values in the Murray-Darling Basin from Indigenous people, Aboriginal people, First Nations people across the basin has been significant. I want to also acknowledge my alluvium colleagues, Lisa Walpole, Bill Molden, Lindsay Charlton, the reviewers. I also want to acknowledge our first Indigenous board member of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. I believe my Dagan, my brother Rene Woods, is in the room with you. And that very much appreciated. I just want to acknowledge that. So partnerships, I just want to acknowledge David said that these are not all the answers, but being involved in the collaboration that brings about the opportunity to pen such case studies, and particularly from a cultural lens and from a cultural position, and look at the interviews we had with three key people from three key communities strategically placed north, west, and along the Murray, is highlighted in our report. But I want to come back to the fact that, you know, these type of partnerships can inform and in fact will inform the progress of water policy and legislation change in our country, particularly across the Murray-Darling Basin. So it will significantly help and inform. But the way forward, you know, as an Indigenous people, we want to create a greater understanding about our cultural science. And these publications give a snapshot, just a mere snapshot, because the real value is sitting on country with the people. Now, the artwork of my background is that done by Faye Mosley, who grew up in Cootamundra Girls' Home, and she uses her art for healing, song, dance, but also for telling and educating stories about it. And those are three mighty arteries. You call them rivers, we call them arteries, because our cultural science is that of a narrative base. So we got on the left-hand side is the Barker, known as the Darling. We got the Bidgie, the Murrumbidgee, and we got the mighty Murray River, who are three rivers that Faye was connected to and highlight significant meeting places. So the reason why I want to talk about the artwork, because it's hard for people to understand our science, because it's not a written science. It's not a Western world science. It is in our song, our dance. It's in our artwork. It's in our stories that are handed transgenerationally down from generations before us. And, you know, that cultural science is testimony to our survival and the way we've interacted with our cultural landscapes. And, you know, on the driest inhabited continent on this planet. Our science, our cultural way of life, our methodologies in interacting with country in a sustainable manner has sustained us as a people, individually, clan-wise and nation-wise. Next slide, please. So testimony to how we use our art to tell our stories and how we continue to use our art in places of significance, of cultural significance and value to us, to inform policy and decision makers in water planning, modelling and management. I want to point out that the middle symbol, the circles, one in the middle, is men and women sitting around the table, around our governance tables together as equals. The one up in the far right is a general meeting area based around a wetland. I want to again highlight Faye Mosley's wonderful artwork, but also we use our totems. And today I'm using Mullion, our wedge-tailed eagle, strength, wisdom, protection, and I trust that Mullion is watching over not just us here in Australia, but our international brothers and sisters that join us. But this global term about nothing about us without us is certainly accelerated throughout Australia. We've found a range of champions through collaboration and partnerships that have developed into really good relationships based on trust and respect and sharing our knowledge. So whilst I say nothing about us without us, I also qualify that by saying only in my personal view, and there are people like Renee that share this ideology, it should not be just on us alone. It should be with us and with us leading, particularly the cultural understanding and how we interweave it into documents and articles and publications such as this to inform and influence change. Reinforcing this cultural science, this narrative. And I want to get you to understand why I use cultural science. We've transgressed from the branding of traditional ecological knowledge. It is a science. It has sustained us because we have lived in that sustainable cultural way of life to coexist with a country that's ever changed since time immemorial. Next slide, please. So to turn to collaborations and partnerships, I've developed this water timeline, First Nations water rights, a timeline of advocacy and reform. And we use the words advocacy and reform because if you can see, we've gone from red, where we virtually had nothing. In the 60s, we only became recognised as human beings after the 1967 referendum. So the first 5 years of my life, I was part of the flora and fauna. But then you see through the 70s and the 80s, it starts to move, and then we get to the 2000s, but particularly in 1983 in New South Wales, the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Rights Act. Then 10 years later, we had the federal government pen and launch and implement the Native Title Act. In 2000s, we started to make some significant inroads with the establishment of Mildren, the Murray Lower Darling Rivers Indigenous Nations, who provided and has continued to provide a very strong voice about water rights, not just land rights. The Lingardi Foundations, the Water Rights Report, Mildren's Echuca Declaration, the Garma International, the Australian government endorsing the UNDRIP, the NAILSMA, the Northern Aboriginal Island Land Sea Management Authority's Mary River Statement. And then we start to see a bit more of acceleration and a bit more inclusion with our voices. In 2010, we had the establishment of the Northern Basin Aboriginal Nations and the National Water Commission's First Peoples Water Engagement Council that was established, and it was an honour to be the inaugural chair. The Human Rights Commission. But look, at the end of it, we start getting into some real populated area in the green, and excited about what the opportunity lies ahead for us as Indigenous people across this country, particularly in the Murray-Darling Basin, with the range of champions that have come on board. Now, one of the reasons why I believe that they are champion is the co-designing, co-penning and sharing the load in designing and putting out these publications. And that couldn't happen without strong relationships and partnerships, particularly between AWP and the World Bank, which then cascades down to the opportunities for us as Indigenous people. And I want to acknowledge that the Australian Water Partnership and the World Bank's commitment to increasing the opportunities for collaboration to raise our voices, not just within our own cultural footprints, but globally. SDG 6, David, you made a bit of a statement there. Yes, we still see operating in a vacuum of opportunity, but again, publications like this can inform, and it can also unlock a greater confidence in our champions that are in the decision making, in the corridors of power, making the decisions, to think with their head, heart, and their hands, and take the opportunity to have a cultural immersion. But these products and these type of publications can help inform that. Next slide, please. So I would just want to say a huge marabou, which is my language, and a shout out to not just the company I work for, Alluvium, but to the World Bank and AWP, and those that are in the room there to support, as well as those joining virtually to support this session. And say a huge marabou again, thank you. We don't have a word for goodbye because goodbye is definitive. We say yanay, which is we'll go, and open for questions at our moderator's lead.
Great. Thank you so much, Bill, and thank you, as always, for your great insight and knowledge that you're sharing. So I'd like to now just move on to a video from Lisa Robbins. She's the principal of Robbins Consulting. So Lisa actually pulled together the synopsis report, which brings together a synopsis of the 3 case studies. So we have a recording from her, which I'll hopefully play now.
Thank you for the opportunity to present an overview of the synthesis report arising from the Valuing Water project. The purpose of the synthesis report was to look across the 3 case studies to elicit insights and generalisable lessons for helping policymakers and other strategic level interests to improve water-related outcomes in other country contexts. While the case study team started with a blank canvas, I started with their 3 reports and worked closely with the core team members to firstly summarise each case study and secondly to draw out the overarching messages from their collective work. In doing so, the technical committee oversighting the Valuing Water project also provided significant input, including through the coordination of review processes. So, what's between the covers? The first few chapters set the scene in terms of contexting the report itself and the Murray-Darling Basin, including its governance arrangements. The synthesis component looks across the case studies to extract insights, which have been characterised in terms of enablers, challenges and future opportunities. The body of the report concludes with a snapshot of the synthesis insights and from these the identification of generalisable lessons. You'll find this summary table in the conclusion section, which shows the key insights according to the categories I mentioned earlier: enablers, challenges and future opportunities. As it's not feasible in the time available to speak to these, I'll give a quick summary of the last column about prospective future opportunities. The case studies found that significant scope exists to advance environmental and cultural values through leveraging policy windows. At the same time, implementation could be fast-tracked by optimising existing legal and regulatory instruments for managing and enforcing environmental and cultural allocations and compliance. More attention is needed to supporting adjustments for those whose values have been diminished. Reinvigorating nested planning and action provides an opportunity to better align lower-level plans and strategies with basin-scale objectives while allowing area and site-specific values to also drive decision-making. Strengthening cross-disciplinary collaborations is essential at all scales to get the design and implementation of environmental and cultural water policy right, coupled with bolstering stakeholder engagement to build broader social, political and interagency support. Scaling up existing successful programs and establishing co-management arrangements provide pre-tested pathways for achieving positive outcomes, and offer particular promise for engagement with First Nations people. Finally, the generalisable lessons are provided not as a roadmap for direct transfer elsewhere, but rather as framing and guidance that should be viewed through the lens of the hydrological, ecological, socio-economic and political context of a specific basin or country. Generalisable lessons are clustered in the report according to 5 categories, namely considering the context, leveraging existing systems and instruments, enabling governance arrangements, shaping markets and pricing, and managing for sustainable outcomes. Some overlap necessarily exists between these categories. Once again, I'll drill down a little into just one of these clusters by way of examples so that you can get a feel for the report's content. So we've got 8 generalisable lessons are identified with respect to that 3rd category there in bold, embedding governance arrangements. So that's in terms of sustained commitment, robust institutions and regulations, dedicated institutions, transboundary institutions and engagement, appropriate scale, legal recognition, First Nations programs and voluntary agreements. So you can see there in the box that each generalisable lesson is described succinctly. So on the slide, I've provided an example for the first lesson, sustained commitment, which I'll let you read yourself. In closing, I hope this brief introduction to the synthesis report has been enough to pique your interests and inspire you to open the report itself and dig a bit deeper into the knowledge that's embedded in its pages. Thank you very much for your interest and attention.
Thanks to Lisa for preparing this video for us and giving us a great overview of the synopsis and the key insights and lessons from that. So I'll just pass back to Eva because we're going to have some respondents from within the room.
Thanks, Kath. And we would like to get to respondents. Renee Woods, I would like to invite Renee from TNC. And we have Andrea Hefner from Griffith University, who is also very familiar with the Mekong River system. Thank you very much. And I think I've already indicated to you that you have a group of online audience there through the camera there, which Dominic is operating. So what we might do, you've heard the presentations of the 3, and you've heard Lisa's reaction. I might start with Andrea. Andrea, does viewing the value of water through the lens of hydrological, ecological, socioeconomic, and political context, that's such a big question, right, allow other countries to position themselves along this continuum? And if you're comfortable to talk about from the perspective of the Mekong River Basin, by all means, it would be really good. We do have a couple of representatives from Mekong joining us as well.
Thanks so much, Eva, and everyone for inviting me to be on the panel. I also would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands I'm normally working and living on, the land of the Yangaba and Kambamere people at the Gold Coast in Australia. It's on the East Coast for people not familiar with it. And I think to your question, and I think I'll keep it a bit broader, and I think I have 3 key points I want to talk about it. And people who listened to my presentation early on in the week, I think one key aspect, and we heard it throughout the 3 topic areas we heard, I think it's about bridging science and policy. And what I mean with that it's good to have all the different values and recognizing the value of that, but the political buy-in, and we have heard that over the last few days, how important that is, to have the political buy-in and focusing on implementation and enforcement. Doesn't matter if that's water laws or others. It's often, particularly as you mentioned in some of the developing countries, there's good laws existing, but if it's not enforced or implemented, there's no political buy-in. It can be very problematic, or progress is very slow and doesn't reach what is required. And I think another key aspect in that area is, and we heard it as well across multiple policy domains, when we think about the economics, the cultural values and the environmental values, we also need to recognize that when we think about water, it's multidimensional. We have agriculture, we have irrigation, in many river basins, hydropower. So I think it's really important, the policy domain, policy coordination and cross-disciplinary teams alongside the political input in order to achieve values and recognizing for different stakeholders what are the values of other peoples in the room. And that links me to my second point, that stakeholder engagement matters. And bringing people together who value these different aspects and understanding the point of view of the other people will really help to create a common sense, at least what matters. They might not necessarily agree, but at least recognizing that different sectors, different areas have different values and highlighting that will help hopefully to make better decisions. And I think the last point I wanted to make is, and that leads to your question in regards to applicability, context matters. We know that, preaching policy and science matters as much in the Murray-Darling as it does in the Mekong and many other river basins. But the context matter. We need to understand the history. We need to understand the different stakeholders, the different ministries, the setup of authorities. We heard differences from the US or Canada, or how river basin organizations in China are different to they are in Australia or the Mekong. So recognizing the context really matters when we think about generalizing some of the context. But the policy science and stakeholders are very valuable across all the three.
And I think you did mention, Andrea, if I'm right, you did mention the context of levers, because different countries have different levers, right? Not just from a governance perspective. And, engaging the private sector, for example.
Yeah, and I think that's what I mean when I talk about stakeholders. It's really important to have the private sector, the companies, but also communities, different people. And that links also to inclusivity. Young people, when we think about values, we think about sustainability, we think about the future. So it's really the transgenerational aspects of that as well across the private sector, communities and government as well, which I mean in the stakeholder process and inclusivity, which I think is really central when we want to understand the different values, because we can see that they're really important in all the three areas, which are very much intertwined.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea. Now, Renee, over to you. When you look at trying to communicate the concept of valuing water outside the whole economic definition, especially from a First Nations perspective, what would be your advice? How could we engage, for example, the First Nation and the broader community in understanding the value, that total value of water?
Yeah, thanks. I'll also acknowledge the land I usually live and work on, the land of the Wurundjeri people in Melbourne, of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and future that are on the call today right around the world. The incorporating that first science, our first science into modern water management, as Phil's timeline showed there, we are starting to sprint, and with the change in the government of the day in Australia at the moment, and also the voice of First Nations people in the water sector is increasing, and with the interest of the government of the day to have more incorporation into the environmental water space, that cultural element of it's not about the resource or the dollar value, it's about making sure our nachis and our totems and our cultural values are strong in the landscape. So communicating that to all the stakeholders is a piece of work that we all need to do. But of course, going back to Phil's little analogy, nothing without us, we need to be telling the narrative and telling the story. And as I've touched on over the course of my presentations the last couple of days, being at that table is the most significant part to be able to communicate that from a First Nations point of view. And there is so many people in the space now and increasing numbers into the space to tell that dialogue. And I think all stakeholders, in particularly in the basin, are starting to understand the value from a First Nations point of view in particular. Yes, we've still got a long way to go, but I'll go back to that timeline Phil put up, just from 2012 to where we are now. So many more people understand the cultural value of water within the basin than what we had in 2012. So that's a good start, but I think we can always do more. And with the Commonwealth Environmental Water Office, with Simon Banks, incorporating those cultural values into his work and his department's work, as well as the state and territories water managers and e-water managers, incorporating cultural values into water they're delivering is helping us communicate that out. Most of the land and waters, the land in particular, we don't own. So we've got to strike those partnerships with private landholders through the TUO and other e-water holders. So I think the narrative is really changing, and at the moment, Mob in particular are ready to go. And there's so many people out there, dynamic people in the space that, and such as Phil and others that are really leading the charge. I'm just lucky enough to be at one of those key decision point of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. Thank you.
But you also have the passion, Renee. We talk about that, how critical that passion is. And I know I asked this at the start of the symposium, that whole contextualization of cultural flows versus environmental flows. And am I right in saying that environmental flows is already taken into consideration when we actually refer to cultural flows, right?
Yeah, in reflection, the cultural flows definition of cultural flows of good water quality, quantity of sufficient flows in the system to have spiritual, cultural, economic outcomes. Now, you look at the economic outcomes, it's not dollar value, as I've said, but also the ownership. At the moment, we're in the environmental bucket that's legislative and has that requirement behind it to have environmental outcomes first. But the TUO and others are incorporating our cultural values to have those outcomes. And I think communicating that it might not be resource or dollar driven on why we want cultural allocations and cultural water delivered onto country. I think that's the narrative shift, and with the space we're working in at the moment to make sure that all stakeholders understand that. And I think the partnerships and strengthening partnerships is helping us tell that story. And cultural flows, as the timeline there, was 2007, but cultural flows have been around for 60,000 years. It's just water in the system at different times of the year for our cultural values to survive.
Thanks, Renee. I would like to hand over to Catherine online, Kath, if there's one question there that we can probably accommodate.
Thanks, Eva. If just checking if there's any questions in the room.
Yes, sorry, Kath, there's one question from the room. We might get you to speak to the mic so that the online delegates could hear. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you for the presentations, and congratulations to the Australian Water Partnership and partners for putting this together. I think it's actually quite an important piece of work. I guess my question is, do you think that the water sector is actively or really engaging around water values? Not just the process of valuation, but as we've talked, as Andrea said, the context and the processes within which those values are derived, and how they are then applied in the decision-making processes, and whose values or what values are privileged there. So do you think because I sort of see the biodiversity and ecosystem services sort of engaging a bit more around this space through their summary for decision makers, but do you feel that the water sector is doing that beyond more valuation as opposed to this other side? Thank you.
That's actually a very appropriate question. Kath, I might throw that to one of the authors, Kath. And if you could take your pick, which one would it be? Because that would have been part of the study that was done, right, Kath?
Yeah, well, I might, maybe I'll ask each of the authors to comment on that, maybe starting with Sarah or Will, if you're there.
Yeah, thanks, Kath. I mean, yeah, great question. I think there is a big push at the moment to start considering all these wider values a lot more, particularly in the Australian context, not just in, we talk about water markets and things, but in the urban space, the water utilities, how they're managing their water, what they're considering when making their decisions is definitely a lot more reflective of both environmental and cultural values than it ever has been before. So I think there's definitely been movement. I think there's still a lot of work to be done. But yeah, there's definitely a positive engagement, I think, at this stage in Australia.
Thanks, Sarah. Rod, did you want to add something to that?
Sure. Thanks, Catherine. I think one of the key things to think about there is actually focusing on those processes by which we make decisions and processes by which we deal with values conflict, really understanding we need to think about finding new and innovative ways to resolve conflicts and coordinate our actions for mutual benefit. And so this is about politics, and it's about thinking beyond the immediate and the simple. It's about greater deliberation, and it's about really beginning to listen to those voices that haven't been heard for a long time, or if ever, in water decision making.
And Phil, maybe building off that last point about voices that have not been heard in decision making, do you have any anything to add in terms of how the values are being used by the water sector and how these values are being used to drive decisions?
I just want to acknowledge Sarah and Rod, and also Andrea and Renee. But so we're all talking about values, and those values are intrinsically linked in some way. But having Sarah and Rod talk about cultural water, and Andrea and Lisa with the synopsis, so these publications can make a difference, are making a difference. But one of the other challenges for water modelers, planners, and managers is we try to get and influence them to think about country first. The Murray-Darling Basin is a huge system that has multiple demands, and the system is struggling to supply to those demands. And we talk about the plan being in place to recover or to help environmentally and culturally now. It's clearly on the table. So I just think that sometimes we need to stop, take a breath, and approach the modelling, planning, designing from a country perspective. And also thinking about what type of environment we're leaving our next generations. So that's definitely a cultural priority for us, but it's also a whole of community issue. So just a couple of things. If we can challenge them to be more curious to plan from a country first perspective and the next generation, and I think if we work back from those couple of things, I think we can definitely find a balance.
Great, thank you, Phil, and thank you, Rod and Sarah, for that response. So I'm being told actually we have to wrap up. I think we managed to fit quite a lot in a very short amount of time. I think it was very rich presentations and discussion, and I'd like to thank the case study authors and presenters, as well as our respondents, for your time and your efforts and your contributions and being part of this launch today. I'd just like to bring your attention to this last slide. So these are the synopsis and the 3 case studies. They're available online. You can get them on the QR code. I forgot to mention the QR codes were actually on each of the presented slides, but you can get them here, or you can get them on the AWP or the World Bank website. So we welcome you to download these, to explore them, to reach out to the authors, and reach out to AWP and the World Bank if you have any questions or want to discuss further. So I'll stop there, and I'll just hand back to Eva to wrap up the session and close. Thanks again.
Thank you, Kath. What I might do, and because this is probably the most hybrid of all the sessions we've had for IRS 2022, right? Marion, can I please get you to take a photo of the 2 panels and the 4 speakers, and of course, I'll plonk myself in the middle. Kath and I have been tic-tacking in terms of how we coordinate this through facilitation. Thank you. Thank you once again to the Australian Water Partnership for this amazing session. The publication, is officially launched, and for using IRS as the launch of this exciting publication, as Catherine has pointed out, go onto the AWP, Australian Water Partnership website, download, comment. You've met the authors, don't be scared. Definitely send an email out to them if you have any questions, reactions, and perspectives on that amazing publication. And thank you once again. I would like to invite all of you down to the plenary for the closing, where we will have Dr. Simon Banks, the Commonwealth water holder, environment water holder, who will talk more about the importance of water for the environment. With that, together with Kath, I would like to thank my co-facilitator online. This is working, Kath. This is good. I would like to thank you, and let's do it again several times, eh? Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the online.
Thanks, bye.